think the next thing we're going to do is try and get everyone sitting down. Ha, 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 ha. Everyone's so engaged. We can get people standing up and just start. Actually, no, you don't need to sit down. You can do the standing up if you'd like. So yesterday we discussed a range of the barriers, and indeed we've been discussing barriers today as well. And actually, it's not good enough to identify what the problems are. We need to go somewhere with them. So I've heard during the conversations yesterday and today things that we can do, concrete things that we can potentially take forward. And what I'd like to do is actually get your thoughts and comments and suggestions, and then actually begin to do something about some of the stuff. Because, you know, Satiris's question yesterday, not yesterday, this morning, this is happening in 5 years' time. We don't have that luxury. So we're going to make it look horrible so we can get people's comments. But when we talked about the regulatory regime yesterday, we said, well, look, often it's prohibited to use flexibility. It's a CapEx-based regulatory approach, so we can't use it. There's a lack of digital mindset, lack of political will and interest. There's a challenge with political cycles, concern over gaming, complexity of the problem, poor regulatory framework, lack of coordination. So I had two concrete things that we could possibly do: showing regulators what the art of the possible is. And, you know, this is not just Intelligent Octopus, this is all those products that are out there. So Gridio or Tibo or anyone, there are solutions out there, and showing those to regulators and saying, how are we going to use this in the new system? So idea one. Idea two, potentially getting the regulators together with industry, you know, or as a small group, and discussing some of the approaches and some of the challenges across the system. So I'd like to do two things. The first thing is to say, option one and option two, could I just have hands up for what I'd like to do is say, do you think option one is sensible? And then do you think option two is sensible? And just hands up if you think, otherwise not. And then what I'd like from you is suggestions to go in the other box. So is that clear? So first question, do you think it is going to be useful if we start showing regulators the art of the possible? Yep. Okay, so that's a sort of a slam dunk. Would anyone be interested, and do they think it's a good idea, in doing a workshop session with some of the regulators? So hands up on that one. So less sort of trickier, I think, is the impression I get. And then, does anyone have any other suggestions of what we could do? And there is a roving mic. Luca.
I'm sorry if I lost the first part of what you were saying because I was in the toilet, but I don't think that it's absolutely necessary that passage from CAPEX to TOTEX. There is another option that we are using in Italy, which is proving very effective, which is the output-based regulation, which means that the regulator gives you an economic incentive to obtain a specific results which goes on top of your mechanism. It's been very effective and can be replicated anywhere.
And you get paid for that?
You get paid if you reach that result. The regulator gives you a target, 1,000 megawatt from distributed resources within 2 years, and if you do it, 100 million is here. Yeah, and that's it.
Fantastic.
1 million is too much, but...
No. You've obviously not had enough coffee this morning, if that's the only suggestion that we can come up with. Any last call? Any final suggestions? So solutions to the regulatory barriers. We've got 3, showing regulators the art of the possible, a workshop session with regulators, and around the CAPEX TOTEX challenge, providing regulators essentially with an overlay on top of the current regime, which is an output measure, which they then get compensated against. Okay. Oh,
Maybe linked to the first point, this showing the art, I would say a next step towards that is really scaling up also what we have achieved as of now. So we've seen that there's a lot of pilot projects also in the different countries, but most of them at least are more on a smaller scale. And one step to really show that this is doable is also scaling up those pilots. But that then is of course linked to other problems. Like if we scale up those problems, those projects, where does, for example, the funding for that come from? These things, but it is a step towards really demonstrating what's possible.
fantastic. And just so you're aware, Maddie at the front is capturing these ideas, so we will at some point refresh the screen. Jonas. Ralph, sorry.
General suggestion. I saw that in California they are planning to have one data point, so one API where you can withdraw all incentive signals. For example, the Octopus incentive signal of their tariff, and it's connected to the end consumer's contract. So whoever has an electric device that wants to react to this thing could use this API to be able to follow the incentive signal of every energy supply. And I think that's a very concrete concept and idea to counteract the lack of digital mindset that we have, especially in Germany with the smart meter gateway discussion.
No, Ralph, that's a really interesting idea, and you might be pleased to note that so the UK, the regulator is running or actually the government is running a smart and secure energy system consultation, and as part of that, they're requiring suppliers to put their time of use tariffs out on a standard. Well, we've been arguing on a standard API. They've been suggesting some sort of data monolith that, anyway, we might get there. Now I saw some other hands.
Yeah, just on this topic of regulation, I guess it's like a bit of a challenge for that I find personally, which is that regulation is always behind what's happening or what you want to be doing or how we want the world or how the world's changing. And you're talking about 5-year regulatory cycles, for example, or various things of that nature. And so it's almost like what you actually want is a regulatory framework that's open, that's principles based, and not necessarily picking up on Lucas' point that says like, oh, you get an incentive for doing this very particular thing, that's a very particular paradigm, it's a very particular way of solving the problem, where you then, all the solutions are doing this one thing, where the reality is the world's moving a lot quicker and we can't really have static solutions. So how do we, what is there sort of examples that we can pull out of regulatory frameworks that have actually provided that space for evolution that's quicker, rather than just stick regulation?
So I don't have an example, but I do know that there was a paper that was written in the UK by an organisation called NICE, I think. No, not NICE. Anyway, they talk about collaborative regulation, where you're doing co-regulation with the industry rather than writing the regulation. So I don't know where that's happening, but that seems to be an interesting model to explore. Any other? So one right at the back there, Andy.
Thank you. Just thinking about how to show regulators and politicians. Do people here have thoughts on what are the channels, what are the ways in which you can do this? Because one is simply go to the regulator as an individual company, put something on their desk and say, you should read this, or look at this slide presentation summarizing what we've done. But there are lots and lots of other ways of showing people what's successful. Any thoughts on what's been the most effective way or ways of actually getting regulators to understand, pay attention to, and get excited about what's been done? So ways of communicating. It'd be great to hear if anybody's had some really good experiences on something that has moved the needle on that respect.
So I think for me the closest I could see that where it's worked in earnest, and I expect is probably similar throughout Europe, is the way it seems though I was working for the government last summer. I spent all my time with our government, with our regulator, considering how we created the tools and provided that resilience for the UK for the winter. And it was we managed to push through so many barriers and move at such pace because there was a real unified objective, which was right in front of you, is how do we exert and create the same pace for net zero? It's too far away, so how do you break it up to get to those sort of levels that create those real drivers to collaborate and move at pace? And yeah, how do you synthesize what we had going into this winter? And that's probably what I'm thinking about of how you engage.
So I've got two comments on to sort of build on what David said, and I guess the first is, I suspect across Europe at some point over the next 5 years, one of the energy systems that are out there is not going to cope. And that just almost seems to me the logical conclusion of what we've been saying. And I think at that point you start seeing a re-examination of what's been going on and that sort of urgency. Now, I hope I'm wrong on that one, because that's sort of, that's sort of catastrophizing. But we need to build on that sense of urgency that's out there. The other thing is, I'd love to walk into the regulator and show them the graph that's up there, just because I think it's so cool, and I think it demonstrates what we mean in a concrete way when we're talking about flexibility. The little bright spots there are all the EVs that are charging. The blue line here is the wholesale price. So when it drops down to its lowest point, that's when we're charging all the cars. And that's just happening day in, day out across the system. And, sometimes you'll see it responding when you have a sort of a negative price or a steep spike. What we haven't overlaid on that is the response to D&O congestion markets. That's part of our challenges, are trying to get data displayed effectively, but we're getting there. But I think this is about demonstrating what our future system is going to need to look like. So maybe.
Sorry, maybe another point. When we talk about regulators, at times they consult consumer associations. And I've been invited a couple of times to something called the Prospective Committee of the French regulator. And the dialogue with these consumer associations can be a bit violent. Going back to GDPR concerns and privacy and data and stuff. And I think there's also quite a lot of work to do on the education of the consumer associations, because regulators can't really go against this kind of strong forces if they are turning too negative. So if all of us could also work a bit on these consumer associations and how we engage with them and educate so that we lower the barrier, I think that could be quite useful.
Okay, so we're going to move on. Oh, should we refresh? No, we'll move on. Oh. No, don't worry. We'll send this, we will send the slide pack around. It'll have some next steps, and I'll probably try and flesh them out in a little bit more detail, because at the minute they're at the sort of the idea stage rather than the delivery stage, and I'm pretty focused on getting to delivery. So on market design, barriers that we came up with: there's no market awareness is poor for OEMs, lack of price signals, often no zonal pricing, generally no dynamic signals at network level. There's quite a lot of complexity. Access to the markets is often challenging. The markets are outdated based on a sort of an old fossil fuel system. Sometimes DER is not able to enter the market, and it's open to gaming. So in the sort of general solution space, I was wondering, for instance, whether there would be appetite to get together around a sort of a workshop format again, looking at where do we see effective market design, but what are the characteristics of that? And trying to work out how much could be applicable in other jurisdictions or for other markets. You know, potentially getting some of the academics who are pretty active in this field involved, because there's a lot of empirical evidence out there about what works. And, you know, if someone's done the work already, we should be picking it up and seeing how that impacts. The other idea is then, given that regulators and government are so often involved in shaping or defining the markets, getting them involved as well. So on the first idea, the question here is would there be any interest in participating in that sort of thing if we were to organize it? So hands up if you think that would be useful. Okay, that's great feedback. So there's no interest. So my solution space here is pretty empty, if you've taken away my only one. Do you have any ideas?
I didn't answer simply because personally I still do not have a strong proposal to do to anyone. The problem is that we have discussed many things, but we haven't come out with a specific design. So what can, okay, we can discuss and share the problems, but then we should also have a solution, as a specific roadmap. Now what happens is that, at least in my opinion, at the European level, the regulators used to listen to bullshitting people, usually giving their solutions, for instance, the associations of consumers associations. I don't want to comment anymore. You need something serious to propose, but I haven't seen it yet.
Just also to explain a bit, at the moment, as we also heard here on the panel session, many things are ongoing in terms of market design. Network or demand response is drafted, EU market design is on the way. On a national level, we have the platform for Plattform klimaneutrales Stromsystem and many other things. So it's hard to say at the moment which measure in this complex situation would help us. We have some uncertainty what will be decided during the course of the year. That's what's driving me with this question, to be honest.
No, and I think that's a really important point, is that where the landscape is already very crowded, adding another initiative on top isn't going to be helpful. So that, I mean, I think that's really useful. So any other suggestions?
So I think instead of, as you discussed, doing a workshop on market design and have perhaps a more general discussion, is there useful to pull together, you know, what I guess DSOs and others have done today that addresses some of the perceived market barriers, and they've worked up solutions. Maybe that's more on kind of the regulatory bit. Because some of that stuff, yes, it's you need to fix long term, but there are workarounds that are being developed in different parts of the world because we need to make progress today. So what I haven't seen in this more general discussions is kind of this, you know, someone pulling together and say, these are the things that we've done that can work as a sort of band-aid in the interim until you fix some of the bigger issues specific to flexibility.
So that's an excellent point. This idea that, and it goes back to the theme that I think some people mentioned yesterday around, you know, don't wait for things being perfect. So if there are stopgap measures or temporary measures which are effective in terms of helping build the market, you know, let's share those. Okay, I'm going to go on to the next one. So economic and commercial barriers. Flexibility is often more expensive. It can favour incumbents from a cost point of view. Flex in Germany especially has no positive business case because mobilizing flexibility is too expensive and we need to invest, or aggregators and suppliers need to invest in the infrastructure, for instance, smart meters. So in a similar vein, high entry costs for distributed energy resources, weak participation. There's a contracting risk with DER. What happens if it fails to deliver? And expensive compared to the next best alternative. So I look at that and I say, well, the first thing is that suppliers and aggregators need to do a better job to drive down costs. Because in a sense, that's our job, is to make flexibility a cost-effective solution. I also think that market design evolution and value stacking, so the ability to value stack means the economics work out better. But they're sort of observations. So any suggestions here on this space? Or is this a wait and see? Like, how do we make it more effective?
So one thing that's come through, a theme that's come through, I guess, is around standardization. And certainly in Australia, one of the things we're thinking about a lot is how to make sure customers are not buying defunct resources now, because 5 years from now, when there is a constraint or we do want to use their resources or we do want to enroll them, we can't, right? So we found that, for instance, with we have a lot of solar inverters at the moment that you just cannot interact with. They're not smart enough for you to interact with, so you have to wait for all of those to be replaced, and then what are they replaced with and stuff. So I wonder if it's sort of some of that stuff where we, like I'm sure there's a lot of already happening in Europe as well, but how like Australia in particular, we just get products that other countries make, right? We're too small a market to drive things ourselves as well. But if we can lend a hand in sort of that messaging around standardization internationally, to get to a point where in the future the cost to participate is lower for customers.
So great point. So first of all, around standardization, and then also around getting ahead of the curve. So, you know, talking with, for instance, regulators in this case, around should there be standards for intelligent EV chargers? Should there be standards for heat pumps that are going in? Should you be required to install a smart meter when you install an EV or a heat pump? Those sorts of, and I know in Germany there's a, 6,000 kilowatt hours, or there are some steps in that direction. Jochen, I think you had a.
Yeah, just a small addition from the Berlin meeting I've been 2 days ago. One thing was also mentioned there, which are the grid tariffs and taxes, and there's some willingness to change it. So that's, I think, also a good message.
Fantastic. Okay, going on to the next one. So some of the technical barriers, and I actually think there's a bit of an overlap between the sort of the cost effectiveness and the technical barriers. So lack of smart meters, lack of interoperability, lack of monitoring and visibility, and there's a lack of visibility therefore, lack of standard APIs and lack of documentation, or lack of APIs in general rather than even standard APIs, low or no network visibility. Sorry, there's a bit of duplication there. Lack of procurement and dispatch platform, accuracy of meters, and reliability of flex. And again, I suspect that this is in almost the same space that the market design question was around, because I suspect there is a lot of activity already happening. But one suggestion I had in this space was, you know, is it worthwhile having conversations at a national level, you know, workshop sort of thing around what might a national flex platform look like? You know, what are the products it might sell? How might it function? And I know the network code for DSR will be active in that space, but I heard a great talk from Torsten Knopp from E.ON, who basically said, look, it's going to be, if you think about the timing for all these sorts of things, by the time it becomes a code and then is implemented in each national jurisdiction and each regulator then, puts it in place or whatever, we're looking at 10 years. And again, I don't think we've got that luxury. So is there anything that can be done in parallel in the grain of the new proposed network code to try and speed up the process? So idea one. Idea two was, workshop discussion sessions, sharing best practice, discussing market learnings. So here I will ask for views on 1 and 2. So on 1, is this space too crowded, or would it be useful to try and facilitate those early discussions? So hands up if you think it would be useful to facilitate early discussions. Okay. So I'm very, very surprised because I was expecting a no on that one, but I think, that might be something to explore. Sotiris.
But not necessarily to develop a national flex platform, I think, because if that's the objective, then you're assuming you know what the problem you're trying to solve and jump in the solution. I think some of the stuff, lack of interoperability data that we have in the UK, we don't have a single register of all the small DR devices, for example. One of the no regret actions is how we address that, and that might be a combination of some easier actions before you go to a 10-year national IT project. And I've been discussing with some of you guys anyway that I think this is there's certainly a live discussion in the UK. I think there's certainly opportunity to show a bit of leadership with trying to offer some transitional solutions before we go to the big digital infrastructure discussion.
Perfect, and I think that also fits with, again, the network code where the development of some sort of asset register is one of the identified aspects of it. David?
I don't know if it fits in this technical barrier bucket, but somewhere I'm involved in something called Flex Assure. There's something called Home Flex. It's essentially an assurance, sort of, not a compliance, but an assurance scheme that bona fides aggregators as doing a good job, being not sharks, basically. So if you are trying to aggregate both from industrial and commercial, or indeed residential, to give an external assurance that this is a bona fide organization and it's not going to rip you off, I think it just further helps unlock some of that inherent distrust that may be out there, because this is all new. We're trying to push barriers. It's trying to interact with folk who've never been part of the energy ecosystem. So having something outside of that to push it, I think, is also important as well. And as we've got the mic, I totally agree with Sotiris on this. I think this is an active debate in the UK. I think going all the way to the national flex market is probably not where we need to get to, but there's lots of things we can do to coordinate in that direction.
Fantastic. Luca?
I think that regarding the technological barriers, we have a problem, because we have a problem. The market is fragmented. The market of manufacturers is fragmented. There are more car manufacturers, many car manufacturers, many heat pump manufacturers, and they are based. Their headquarters is in different countries. For instance, I've been trying for months to speak with someone, car manufacturer, but in Italy, nobody is relevant. Or you speak with the German guys, or you cannot speak about technology. Or France, or whatever. No, for heat pumps, it's the same. Who is talking with them? How is interaction with them? We do not have Amazon, we do not have Microsoft, and we do not have Apple here. There are 10 people. There are 10, 20 companies making the future. We need to speak with them and to find with them a solution. They are not, they are totally unaware of this. We are discussing. I'm talking about the heat pumps producer, at least the ones I've interacted with. The car manufacturers are a bit ahead, but heat pumps manufacturers are totally unaware of all what we are discussing here. Who is teaching them? Who is talking with them?
So I think it's a great point that that the energy sector is being invaded or is joining up and becoming a mega sector, including the heating and transport elements of it. I think there are a number of people here who are talking to car manufacturers and heat pump operators. You know, companies like Eno or Gelex, or companies like Octopus. So we talk a lot with EV manufacturers, and we have to do that because we have to integrate those EVs with those EVs to be able to offer products like that. But the point about standardization, again, that standardization and interoperability is absolutely key, because currently in the market, every single make of every single model of every single make almost has a slightly different way of interacting. And that's a huge cost across the industry if you're trying to integrate thousands and thousands of makes and models. Andy.
Just picking up on that, is there an opportunity to learn from those discussions that are going on with the EV manufacturers, who I think, you know, you're right, heat pump manufacturers are way behind. They're not even thinking about how consumers use their products. They're not thinking about how do these things fit into the grid. They are, as far as I've observed, manufacturing companies. They churn out hardware, they sell it to wholesalers, and then for the most part they then step back and have very little, other than warranty, very little to do with how the product is used. It feels like, although there's still lots of work to do with EV companies, can we help the heat pump manufacturers learn from where the EV manufacturers are today to think ahead about how are these products going to be used, or how can they be used?
Great point. And Ralph has another.
One more comment to the same topic. I think one challenge in Germany, at least, is the big incentive to consume energy behind the meter. So you have a PV on your roof in Germany. Most EV drivers, I think 50% of EV drivers today, private EV drivers, have a single-family building with a PV on the roof. And we have hundreds of thousands of batteries installed in these houses. They are only used to increase the autarky of the buildings. They are not used in front of the meter. So I think what we would need there is the change of regulation that really puts this flexibility out of the single-family building into the grid and into the system. That would help to convince the heat pump operators, the battery storage manufacturers, and the EV manufacturers.
Great point, and that really highlights the challenge that one barrier has therefore an impact on the other, on our ability to do and remove some of the other barriers. You know, so there's regulatory rules and taxes around how you're using the energy from the home, which then impact how attractive it is for consumers, which impacts what devices they buy, and which impacts the influence on OEMs. But you know, we're taking it one step at a time, and I think we will get there. Now, is that the last? There's consumer behavior. So in a sense, this is almost the summation of all the other previous barriers, because I think if if demand response and demand shifting and flexibility becomes possible technically and economically, and from a regulatory point of view, then suppliers and aggregators who are dealing with consumers are able to offer attractive propositions. I didn't have any great suggestions in this space. I don't know if any of you are slightly more wide awake than I am. So any comments here? So from a leader.
Probably just one suggestion, which is also us being educated on customers. So the other way around as well. Like if we're developing new products and we're not used to developing new products for new market segments, you know, can we learn from other markets and other product design spaces, and also, you know, retailers and suppliers like Octopus talking to us about things as well. I think it's really great. So I think we often think of customer education as just we need to educate our customers about what's happening in the market. But I think it's also us actually understanding segmentation, understanding how customers want to use our product.
Completely agree, except I also offer a counter challenge back, which is, and it goes back to Greg's point that he made on the first day. If there are the price signals that tell us what's expensive and what's cheap, we can then, as suppliers and aggregators, package that up in a myriad of ways to provide consumers. And so what we need, the richness of the intelligence that comes with a price signal to be able to create the products that the energy system needs. Okay, so, Serge.
Just on the point of the consumers who don't want to give control, I think there's a serious misunderstanding here, because they do. And you don't have to give control away. You can deliver flexibility services and yet keep control. So there's a genuine misunderstanding, I think, from the whole industry that there is a consumer barrier that we need to overcome. That's not the case. I mean, I guess that you guys experience that with our own populations. We have zero problem with consumers, zero. They do allow us to control their EV charging under conditions for the good reasons. But there is no consumer barrier there, at least on the control side.
Absolutely agree. And I think, you know, the chart on the wall sort of demonstrates that we're not achieving 30% growth month on month because that's a barrier. You know, if the value proposition is clear for consumers, they're willing to participate. We are, I suspect, we're not too bad, and we might, my presentation, which is after Michael's, will be pretty short, I think. But we're now going to hand over to Michael. So one of the barriers we talked about was gaming. And it's a really challenging subject because you want to develop flexibility markets, you want to bring all these sorts of things, and so therefore you hesitate to say, well, how do you manage gaming? And one of the challenges is around how do you establish effective baselines? And I think, you know, we as an industry need to have some grown-up conversations, and we need to do some good work in this space because it's a problem, but it's a problem to be solved. And Michael's going to take us through that.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Moshe. Do you have the clicker? Need that. Cool. So yeah, so I think we're at a point now in the proceedings where we're really getting into kind of the meat of the issue, right? And so as Marsha says, I think, and Simone actually mentioned this very well earlier, I think baselining and kind of potential gaming is a kind of key issue that we really need to be explicitly talking about. So I'll start, I guess, with a little bit of scene setting, and this is a chart you've pretty much seen before. This is stolen from Maddie's slides. And I think basically we're talking about this kind of paradigm in which we have increasing DSO, or actually this could be TSO as well, intervention in one direction, and then we have increasing market-led solutions in the other. And so there's more or less kind of one dimension here, but there are a few kind of nuances, so I think it's useful to think about it in two ways. So we have kind of, price signals that are really just exposed, broadcast, that's clearly market-led and low intervention. And then we have kind of aggregator markets, where we're kind of explicitly dispatching flex, but through kind of aggregators and through kind of high-level platforms, whereas as compared to central dispatch markets, where we're really saying, okay, tell me about all or almost all of your assets, and I'll make one central decision about that. So aggregator, I guess, should be kind of thought of as decentralized versus centralized. We have dynamic operating limits, which we've kind of, Alida talked about yesterday. So this is where we say either kind of over certain periods, you're allowed to consume or generate less. And then we have direct device control, which I think we're all kind of familiar with. So just to kind of frame this, can I get a slide, please? So yeah, I guess to kind of frame the projects we've already talked about to date. So we've got Project Shift, which Satiris actually didn't mention, but I was expecting him to, 2.0. We've got Firm, which Pedro did, and also kind of GB DSO solutions I would put in this kind of aggregator market, decentralized, but explicit market space. We've got GoPax, which Maddie mentioned, so that's a kind of central dispatch from TSO and DSO jointly, and then TSO balancing, so certainly in GB, but my understanding is, across Europe, there's this kind of central market for TSO balancing, and it's kind of dispatched in one place. And then we have Project Edith in the dynamic operating constraints, which I mentioned. And then I think we're almost entirely agreed that this kind of direct device control can be crossed off, which is good news as far as I'm concerned. So, okay, so that was scene setting, and I'm going to kind of dive into this explicit flex. I won't distinguish between kind of decentralized or centralized. The kind of the gaming issues I think apply in both cases. Excellent. So, introduction to baselining. So, I think we're all familiar, and it's been mentioned before, but this is basically the quantified counterfactual of what would have happened if this kind of explicit dispatch action had not been taken. But of course, that doesn't occur, right, because the action was taken. And so that's kind of quite difficult in of itself, right? And I think, as we're familiar, there's a kind of gaming risk. And what really are the risks? I think it's the kind of loss of system value and confidence that we're really delivering the right service for the system. And so there's kind of a few kind of key pillars I think that we need to access to make a good baseline. So that's resilient to gaming, technology agnostic, with some caveats maybe, accurate, and using available data being key. So I think I would summarize the kind of two current approaches to baselining in general in these two ways, right? So we either have forecasts, so this could be, normally it's the provider produces their own forecast and submits a physical notification or an expected behavior of that asset or group of assets, or we have a kind of formula based on recent history, and this here is an example from the capacity market in GB. So you take, often it can be quite a kind of complex formula, but it's based on kind of averages across different days that look, and time periods that look similar. So yeah, do recent history baselines work? So yes and no, right? So it's impossible to characterize all assets well with a single formula. They generally tend to assume demand destruction. So we don't have this concept that actually you're shifting that demand and you need to recover later on. And that's particularly problematic for energy limited assets or consumer demand. They're problematic for regularly activated services, right? So if you don't have a lot of periods where you're not activating it to base this kind of history on, you can't say what would have happened if you weren't taking that action. And they're exacerbated at low aggregation level. So I think Maddie showed this chart yesterday. So when we have kind of, lots of assets at a high aggregation level, we can get pretty accurate. This is the kind of histogram of the forecast error. But once we get to the really low levels of granularity and small asset numbers, we basically don't do a very good job. Okay, so what do we mean by gaming? So here in the middle, I've got a kind of example. And this was a Twitter post after our saving session, so the demand flexibility service, our specific kind of product that delivered that. And this is someone clearly leaving their oven open in the before the event on the same day, because we had this in-day adjustment. And so they're ramping up their comparative recent history so that their baseline looks high and their paid for delta is greater. So I think it's fair to say that dishonest actors will manipulate their behavior, and this is a genuine problem. And I think certain formulae are more susceptible to this. So if you have periods that you continue after the activation, for example, that can really lead to ease of gaming, I suppose. And also when there's no cost to alter the behavior in the reference period. So as I say, I mean, here you're not penalized from turning your oven on, except that you pay for that energy. But yeah, it definitely very easily pays for itself in the payment of the service. And it's not just a demand problem. So I guess I'm focusing on demand here, but actually it's a generator problem as well. And we can start to think about whether we should get more asset specific. So it's less technology agnostic, less neutral, but that could help us kind of fix some specific problems that we have. Okay, so back to this kind of comparison I showed before. So what are the pros and cons of forecasting versus recent history? So with forecasting, the provider is clearly free to choose, right? So we kind of trust that the provider tells us something that they really would be doing in the future. And so that necessarily requires kind of incentives on accuracy. But they can make that match their asset kind of correctly, if incentivized to do so, as opposed to the kind of the formulaic method where the provider isn't free to choose. So the service operator, or normally the TSO or DSO, sets that formula and is confident in what that is, but this kind of generic specification is unlikely to reflect all assets, and it's quite hard to block gaming in general. So potential solutions. So I think continual monitoring is key. So we need to kind of put a baseline out to the market, see how it goes over time, and clearly data is kind of critical for not just the baselining itself, but also that evaluation process. Forecasting in kind of short term could work quite well. And in fact, this works very well. In GB, for example, in the balancing mechanism, we have forecast baselines or provider-nominated baselines, and that works well because they're incentivized to tell us what they really are going to do. Otherwise, they'll be penalized on the markets, wholesale markets, I should say. So also other data can be useful. So not just consumption data, but weather data or other things that will actually genuinely affect that counterfactual and also the real behavior of the asset. And finally, price response. So we definitely need to think about the gaming when we design this, right? And as I think Marcia said, gaming can happen, and we need to make sure that we're thinking about that in our market and baseline design. Oh, too far. Thanks. So in summary, baseline deserves more resources from all of us in the room as well as policymakers, because as Simona said, this really is a critical piece of market design, in my view. We need to, be aware that cowboys will exist, and we need to kind of all work together to come to a good solution for the system and for providers. Set and forget approach doesn't work. We need to continually monitor and iterate over time. This strive for kind of technology agnostic baselines may not be the best solution, and I think we need to accept that isn't a given that it is. Incentives are a great cure. As I said, this kind of wholesale market incentive to actually give your correct physical positions really does work very well. And we need to think about how this works at a local level as well as a national. So I think the key takeaway I would say is that we all need to work together in kind of industry task forces that are overseen and sponsored by regulators. Yes, so question for you as the audience. So, we've talked about all of this kind of spectrum of approaches, baselining being a key component of explicit flexibility approaches. So if we put reinforcement to the side for now, which approach do you think has the most potential to manage constraints in the long term? Is it implicit flexibility, so broadcast market signals? Is it explicit, where we're actually sending dispatch requests for fixed volumes? Is it operating envelopes, where we're allowed to take certain decisions over certain time periods? Or is it direct control of the assets? So yeah, maybe a show of hands. So who thinks implicit flexibility? We've said before you're going to have all of these, but if you had to pick one, who would say implicit flexibility is the answer? Okay. So I'd say about half, something like that. A half and a half, good, yeah. Explicit flexibility?
Can I vote twice?
No, absolutely not. Okay, that's the other half. And operating envelopes, dynamic or static? Okay, not less on that one. Or direct control? Excellent. Okay. Okay, and so I guess we've touched on this a little bit before, but how do we work on solving these problems together? Does anyone have any bright ideas? No. Okay. Yes, David.
What's going through my head is a fantastic topic. Absolutely need to put more resource on it, otherwise we undermine flexibility as a whole, and it's really dangerous. There's part of that education piece. Is it people are gaming it because it's one-upmanship? Is it for the financial return that they're getting there? Or is it the smart Alex just wanting to prove a point? And there's been around consumer behaviour there, responding to price signals, but also the wider education of your actions. This is what's happening on the system, and overlaying that into the conversation, I think is there more you can do to stop that gaming by telling the fuller story from different perspectives, because I don't think that's seen at the moment. And I must admit, I love to see out of your 700,000 odd customers who participated. We had folk in our office go, yeah, I know the rules, I can do this. It's like, well, that's very good, it's your report, but we know it's not perfect, it can't be. What percentage do you think of your customer base was operating perversely, do you think? I'm very interested. Is it a tiny minority, or is it, because sharing things on Twitter, it's easy to share those hacks. How much does that go, oh, that's great, I just don't necessarily know, I know the scale, but it's damaging irrespective because it's there.
Yes, yeah, I mean, I think, well, maybe you're making one of my points for me, I think, in that we probably don't know the scale, right? Because we don't have this continual monitoring. So I think, yes, absolutely, right? That might be the one customer out of 700,000 who's doing this, and then I think we can all sleep happy, right? But I think it may not be, and I think we need to work that out for sure. Just on the point of, no, I've lost my train of thought. But yes, I think that definitely is a good question, which maybe Simona we should take away to try and find some ways to work out in the kind of post hoc analysis.
Yeah, I think it was definitely probably a small proportion of our customers, and I think there's like some special energy forums that very nerdy energy geeks were on talking about. I think they called it power reps or something. They had like their own, yeah. But I think it is a small proportion of customers. But if we don't fix the issue, then obviously with more, if they keep sharing their tips, then we could grow. But yeah, I think for singing sessions, it was small.
And actually, I remember my other thought, which was around, so you said, yeah, this, I guess even by calling it gaming, right, we're suggesting that we think some people are just kind of doing this for fun, right? And I think, yeah, part of the key educational piece is probably the way in which this is smeared across all consumers, right? So that's, when we do set it up as a kind of purely, this is for your financial benefit, then they are perhaps incentivized to do that. But in practice, you know, that additional balancing cost gets smeared across, and actually, if we shared that with them, they might take different actions.
How is it any different to a peaker operator deciding to pull back and waiting for markets to go higher? I mean,
absolutely, but that's still gaming that we need to address, right? Yes.
My point is that let's not it needs a whole system thinking approach, and not just this is a new resource category, so let's massively over-index on this, and so it's not to take away from your point that baselining by technologies is important, but also we should not just lose sight of the big picture.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's more, if you go the incumbent as is ecosystem, there are ways and things and regulators and the operators, etc. Probably more due, and there's probably ways to do that, but I absolutely agree, Alex, that we can't just overtly go, right, we've got to over-regulate, but over-enforce, overthink flexibility because it's new, ignore everything else. We don't have the mechanisms here. There are other mechanisms that do need to be used for the as-is as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the only one of those four that suffer from baselining is explicit flexibility. The other three don't actually suffer from baselining problems. And you can combine those other three into solutions that gives you the same sort of tools that you would get from explicit flexibility. And you also, direct control and operating envelopes doesn't necessarily come without incentives, right? So it's not that the customer doesn't get an incentive for those things, but they're just different mechanisms. I think you can actually design the whole system without explicit flexibility, using implicit flexibility, direct control and operating envelopes, and just get away from the baseline issue altogether.
Yeah, really interesting point. Yeah, I guess maybe that was a better question. Which combination of these four do you like most? But yes, no, totally agree. And I think that, Maddie made this point yesterday, right? That this really is explicit flexibilities, or one of the key cons of explicit flexibility when we compare them to the rest. Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'll leave it there.
So we're now on the home run. There is one more presentation that I'm actually going to do really quickly, partly because I don't think we need it, and partly because I'm beginning to stand between you and lunch. And so on that note, there will be lunch that you can take away with you, or stay here and chat with people. But for those who need to catch trains and planes, please go back to where you found food and coffee earlier, and there should be some food to take away. So one of the other things I thought it might be worth covering is actually a lot of these things aren't as complicated as they might seem. You know, we show great graphs, and actually that's not on display at the minute. We show great graphs and high-tech stuff, but actually getting to flex markets is not, like, it isn't rocket science. So you basically need to know what you need to know how you're going to buy it, and then you need to dispatch it. And you know, people have talked about the UK market, but there are a whole range of other approaches out there. You know, have a look, decide what you need to buy. How are you going to procure it? Well, again, you can now go shopping for a platform. Richard Sarti was here yesterday. He's not here today, unfortunately, but you know, Nodes is one of the solutions. Piclo, Radesh is using Piclo, I think, Flexible Power in the UK. There's a whole range of platforms out there. Go buy one. I think one of the challenging things is visibility of where you need flex. And so that's, you know, there are emerging solutions to that. There are a wide range of people who provide grid analytics, who provide low voltage monitoring, who provide integration with, you know, taking data feeds from smart meters and from other assets that are on the system to build up a picture of what's happening. But, you know, worst case scenario, you take your analog signal from your substations and work out which ones are looking a bit dodgy. And, you know, you can look at procuring flex as a, you know, in the interim as you begin to get much better visibility. So there's nothing to stop us putting this sort of thing in a year's time. And that's the level of progress we need to get to if in 5 years' time we're sitting at Terna's or Italy's penetration of these sorts of devices. And that's true across all of Europe. So pictures of where these can be displayed. I think these are probably pictures courtesy of sort of monitoring that's going on at DNO level of networks. You know, you can see what's happening. You can see where you need flex. You can become highly granular. You know, if you have a small constrained zone, there are resources that can help. And maybe not today, but maybe next month, maybe next year. And starting to think about the level of granularity you need is going to be important as you move forward, and important to provide those signals to suppliers. Brilliant. And as I said before, there's a range of platforms out there. So lessons from GB. If you are building flex platforms, standardization across the country is really useful. The same issue with standardization of APIs. The fewer different systems you have to interact with, the greater the liquidity in the market you're going to get. So having the same product definitions, having the same procurement and dispatch platforms, and having the same contracts is really, really helpful. And we've just talked about baselines, but they are going to become an increasingly important discussion going forward. So this is sort of me summing up, and I have 2 slides. You'll be pleased to know. We know flex works. If we want to be using flex operationally across the board, not as pilots, not as small-scale projects, we don't have time. We can't keep piloting, and it's been fantastic hearing people already, you know, way beyond me talking about how they're using it, how they are moving from pilots to direct control, direct use in the control room or direct system. I'm pretty keen as an engineer in being clear what the technical needs of the system are, not relying on ways we have defined markets and products historically, but being clear what the technical requirements are we're looking for, and then don't make them look like a gas-fired power station. Just be as close to being technologically agnostic and voltage level agnostic as you can be. And, you know, we all have a responsibility to allow consumers to use the system flexibly and get value from it. I started with this and I'll finish with it. We're facing an epoch-defining moment in energy. If we are to transition to a net zero system, net zero energy system, we need to turn the energy sector upside down and put the consumer at the heart of all of that. And the workshop is, I think, the start of this discussion about how we take forward this multiplicity of solutions and how we continue to challenge the status quo, but also ourselves as flex providers. And it's about learning and working together, and it's about making it real. So, guys, thank you all very much. I've had a fantastic time. I've really, really appreciated the conversations we've had, the speakers we've had, and I'd just like to thank you for your energy and enthusiasm. And then hand over to Andy, who's going to sum up.
Well, actually, I'm not even going to try to sum up, but just to say a big thank you. Thank you for joining us here for the last 24 hours. I hope you found it useful and stimulating. I know I have. And if you have any feedback for us on this event, for future events, we're always very, very keen to hear it. Now, I know there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm very optimistic. We really are at a turning point in creating a more flexible future, and really look forward to working with you, collaborating with all of you as we make that a reality. So yes, thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to host you here in Munich. Look forward to seeing you again soon. And yes, please grab food, drinks on your way out, and safe travels home. Thank you, Marsha.